Lewis Wall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Talofa lava. It is my pleasure to speak on this, the Customs and Excise Tobacco Products Budget Measures Amendment Bill. And I actually want to start with a quote, and it's from a submission to the Finance and Expenditure Budget Policy Statement 2016 from the Cancer Society Social and Behavioural Research Unit from the University of Otago. And I read, evidence for the effectiveness of tobacco excise tax and the pricing policies is overwhelming. Increased costs of tobacco to consumers are strongly associated with declining smoking prevalence and reduced tobacco consumption. Young people tend to be more price sensitive compared with adults. And it goes on to say, lower socio-economic groups and Māori have disproportionately higher smoking rates in New Zealand and have shown less rapid declines in smoking prevalence than other population groups. There is strong evidence that low-income groups within high-income countries show greater price sensitivity. Recent evidence suggests that smokers from Māori and Pacific Island communities are more responsive to tax increases than smokers of other ethnicities. This suggests that further tobacco excise tax increases could continue to reduce health inequalities in New Zealand. The reason that I read that out is actually that is why this legislation has been proposed today. And I also would like to highlight the relevance to young people and particularly to young Māori and young Māori women. So I have the Māori Smoking and Tobacco Use 2011 summary from the Ministry of Health, and in the 15 to 19 year age group, male smokers, male smokers, 14.4% rates of smoking. For Māori males, it's 29.2%. For females, 13.1%. For Māori females, it's 47.1%. And in the 20 to 24 age group, males, 24.7%. Māori males, 57.3%. Females, it's 24.5%, but for Māori females, the smoking rate is 60.8%. So the relevance of this particular legislation to our Māori communities is incredibly important, and I also want to highlight that Māori women, and this is from the report that the Māori Affairs Select Committee prepared during the inquiry into the tobacco industry in Aotearoa and the consequences of tobacco use on Māori. And I quote from there, Māori women suffer significantly from smoking, as it is evidenced by their having one of the highest mortality rates for lung cancer in the world and distressingly high levels of other diseases associated with smoking, such as diabetes complications, cardiovascular disease, breast cancer and cervical cancer. And we are even more concerned about this demographic because of the significant impact of smoking on unborn and young children. While it is not the only cause, we were told that up to 46% of sudden unexplained death in infancy is attributed to smoking. 40 babies die in New Zealand every year. So 46% of those babies are Māori babies. So for our communities out there who question why this piece of legislation is going through the House, that's why. The statistics, the evidence speaks for itself. I'd like to highlight, however, that there are other implications of the proposed legislation on Māori. And so it was really interesting to read the Minister's press release, because what he does articulate is that 15% of New Zealanders smoke. Now that's 550,000 people, but for Māori and Pacific those rates are a lot higher. So that's 35% of Māori smoke and 22.4% of Pacific people smoke. And actually if you break that down even more, of the 550,000 people who smoke, that's 155,000 Māori who smoke, and that's 55,000 Pacific who smoke. And I think the relevance to our communities, actually for me, is also in the amount of tax that will be collected through this proposed legislation, Mr. Speaker. So we're anticipating that $425 million will result over this 4-year period from this increased tax. So I guess my proposition to the Minister and to the House is that if that's the case, $119 million of that tax take should be used explicitly on Māori programs, and $42.5 million should be used on Pacific programs. And I think it's relevant again to bring up the Māori Affairs Select Committee report, because actually recommendation 26 of that report was really clear, and I will read it, that the Y844 claim lodged with the Waitangi Tribunal, which asks for funding for Māori health initiatives to eliminate or reduce smoking among Māori, be progressed as soon as possible. I've actually written to the Waitangi Tribunal and asked them the status of that Y claim, because in the government's response, this Y claim has not been referred to the government. And it can't be referred to the government until the Waitangi Tribunal actually go through the process of hearing submissions. But it is my contention that if Māori are so detrimentally affected, that if we are really clear about our, our rates of smoking and the anticipated amount of money coming out of our communities, we know that it's going to be $425 million, then I restate again, $119 million of that tax cut should be used to fulfil the recommendation by the Māori Affairs Select Committee. I'd also like to highlight another issue from that inquiry by the Māori Health Affairs Select Committee, and it actually is about plain packaging. And the relevance of plain packaging actually speaks to our commitment to reducing the smoking rates of young people. Because I have I looked at the evidence for plain packaging, and actually it was overwhelming. And the Cancer Council of Australia actually provided the most succinct evidence, because as we all know, Australia remains the only country in the world that has plain packaging legislation and has implemented that legislation. And this is why they did that, Mr. Speaker. Because plain packaging provides an important role in discouraging young people from trying cigarettes in the first place. And what a lot of people don't know is that 66% of young people in New Zealand try tobacco. And I put my hand up. I've smoked once in my life, and it was through peer pressure, but actually 66% of young New Zealanders try tobacco. And so if anything that will reduce them even attempting tobacco needs to be promoted, because what we do know is that 50% of those young people who try tobacco or smoke will smoke for, 50% of them will smoke for 40 years. They become addicted to it almost immediately. And actually in our Māori communities, I think, Mr. Speaker, that more like 100% of us try, which is why for Māori women our rates of smoking are over 50%. We're the perfect statistical example of that phenomenon. The other reason plain packaging needs to be brought in is that through the evidence, young people said themselves that plain packaging creates negative perceptions and feelings about smoking, and they actually want to hide the packets and they smoke less around others. And it increases their ability to think about quitting, and that was in 50% of the participants. So for Māori, that would be incredibly relevant, because if 100% of us try, 50% of us then smoke, if these plain packaging can then reduce by another 25% our consumption, then I actually think that it's worth the government looking at plain packaging as another part of this progressive piece of legislation that actually does want to meet the 2025 target, which was to ensure that right across the board, our different groups of New Zealanders, Pākehā, Māori, Pacific, Asian, actually we have less than 5% of our population smoke. And I think that's the challenge as we move into the future, but this is a fantastic start. So I commend the Minister, I commend ASH, I commend all those groups out there who are advocating for us to address this issue, because it can't be tolerated anymore. 5,000 of us dying is unacceptable and it's preventable. Thank you.
Dr. Shane.